This is my third interview with Dean Radin, the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Dean has written numerous books, including The Conscious Universe, The Scientific Truth of Psychic Phenomena. In our last interview, we talked in depth about an experiment Dean was working on, the SIGIL experiment. Now, amongst other things, Dean unpacks the results and implications. Scroll into the description for timestamps, extra info, and useful links. And if you enjoy this video, please like, comment, and share. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this with me again, Dean. I really appreciate it. Last time we spoke, we talked in depth about an experiment that you had in the works, the SIGIL experiment. I'm sure plenty of people that are watching this saw that episode, but if not, or seeing as it's been a while, could you please recap or summarize that experiment before we start talking about the results and your findings?
SIGIL is an acronym for Scientific Investigation of Gazing with Intuition at Light. And sometimes I don't use the word intuition, I might use the word intention, but it's the idea that if you have an optical double slit system, the classic way of demonstrating the wave-particle duality of light, there is something called the quantum observer effect, which is that if you know which of the two slits that a photon can go through, that the photon will behave differently. It'll change from wave-like to particle-like. So this is part of the measurement problem within quantum mechanics and still an unsolved problem. There are lots of interpretations about why this effect occurs. So we've done a number of experiments using a double slit system where we would ask people to use their minds to see if they could gain which path information from the photons and then see whether or not there was a difference in the interference pattern. We're one of 5 labs that has done this kind of experiment so far, and of the 30 experiments that have been reported, 14 are significant two-tailed, which means that the initial prediction would be that the particles, the photons would turn into particles, and that is what we see most of the time, but not always. Sometimes you get more wave-like behavior. So you use a two-tailed statistic because it's just saying that something deviant happened, like it significantly deviated from where we expected it to go. We can't always predict at this point which direction it's going to go. But if you do the statistics on how often can you expect that 14 out of 30 experiments would get at least a 0.05 probability two-tailed effect, which if you're not a statistician will sound like gobbledygook.
A little bit.
The answer is a 6 sigma result, which is roughly 1 billion to 1. So beyond 1 billion to 1. So that tells us that something interesting is going on in these experiments. The problem with using a double slit system is that they tend to be expensive and the analysis is not that easy. So this new experiment, the SIGIL experiment, is using a transparent diffraction grating. The diffraction grating is 500 lines per millimeter. So there's lots and lots of slits, essentially. Wow. And you shine a laser through it, and instead of getting a complicated interference pattern, you do get an interference pattern, but it consists only of discrete dots of light. So you get one that goes straight through, it's called a central maximum, and then 2 on either side, and then dimmer ones further out. So the reason why this is interesting is because the central dot that you get when you shine the laser directly through it, you can think of as being consisting of both photons behaving like particles, because it goes straight through, and also like waves, because if you're not looking at it, a photon is both, essentially. So the central beam is more or less wave and particle at the same time. But the 2 side beams are only there because of the wave-like nature of light. They reflect interference. So if you provide a feedback signal based on the amount of light in one of those dots, that will tell you how much interference is going on. And this experiment then provides feedback from one of those dots, and then the person's task is to observe it with feedback. They get various kinds of feedback from a graph on a screen and so on. And the idea is that if you are observing that particular dot, you actually get a little bit of which path information because of something called position localization. You have this big interference pattern, and you're looking only at one little piece of it. And by virtue of only looking at that one piece, you're localizing where in the interference pattern you're interested, and that provides a little bit of which path information. So you would, if it works, you would collapse the waves into particles at that spot. And then the light would go down because there's no wave-like behavior anymore, and interference would go away. So that's the general idea. So that was part of the idea. The second part, though, was that in thinking about the participants for this, we did a worldwide search for two types of people. Some would have practice in an inward focus of attention, namely meditators, and the others would have practice in an outward focus of attention, namely magicians, esoteric practitioners. Because the whole point of enchantment is external. You're externalizing what's happening in your head. So we made a speculation. I wouldn't put it as strong as a prediction, but we speculated that the magicians would do better in this test than the meditators, even though in most previous experiments we used meditators. They would do better because the task involves influencing something out there. It's not influencing something inside. Now, for very advanced meditators, they may not make much of a distinction between inside and outside. But you need to be really advanced to get to that stage. And I've worked with a few who said that, like they did really well in this kind of experiment. And I said, well, how did you send your mind over there? And the answer was, I didn't go over there. I went deeper inside because like the whole world out there is already inside. But again, that's very advanced form of meditation. So in this case, I figured, okay, well, magicians sort of do this anyway. That's part of the practice. And maybe they would do better. And the bottom line is they did. They did significantly better than the meditators. So that was interesting. The experiment is finished now. We had 50 people were identified as candidates, 47 finished. So each person was asked to do 10 formal sessions. So we have 470 20-minute sessions, which involve 30 seconds of paying attention to the system and then 30 seconds withdrawing back and forth for 20 minutes. So we have a lot of data here. And one of the more interesting results is I mentioned that you had two dots of light that are the ones of interest, and we give feedback on one, but we never gave feedback on the other one. And what that allows us to do is provide a continuously recorded control, which you're not observing, as compared to one that you are observing. And so now the question is, well, does the one you're observing, does that change and the other one doesn't? The answer is yes. Which is really interesting because it means a couple things. First of all, it looks like you are withdrawing a little bit of which path information, which would collapse the wave function. And if it was an artifact, if it was caused by some environmental thing or temperature change or whatever, it would also affect the other one because after all, these two things are within, literally that far apart inside the apparatus, and they're not affected the same way. So that's why I had two different measures going on inside this apparatus, because if I were to do this in a physics lab and I had a budget of $200,000, I would do it differently because you need extremely stable lasers and you have vibration isolation tables and on and on. You can do it really, really tight. But I didn't have that. I had a pretty small budget, and so I had to make these boxes by hand. And I was thinking then, well, how can I check if there was actually some kind of environmental influence that was causing the result? Well, this is what I came up with as a method. And I also included a whole bunch of other sensors: temperature, magnetic fields, orientation, vibration, on and on and on. So I did have a way of characterizing the environment, and none of them show that the results are an artifact. So this is, I would rather have a $200,000 budget because I'd rather use the really top-end equipment. But sometimes you have to be clever and figure out some other way of doing it. So that's what I did. And so I'll be submitting another grant to see if I can get additional funds. And I have ideas of how to make this even more sensitive. And more importantly, does this show that consciousness collapses the wave function? Because after all, that's one of the original ideas. And an argument can be made that the answer is no, even with the results that we got. And the reason is that if you're more like put on your conventional physicist hat, you would say that the reason why this happens is because of an interaction with a physical detector. That's what most physicists would say. That has nothing to do with consciousness. It has to do with interaction with a physical detector that is collapsing something, even weakly, even just a bare measurement. Still, that's what's happening. So somebody could say, and I think realistically saying, well, yeah, there is a human that's doing the observation, but there's also a physical effect that happens as a result of that observation.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, the occipital lobe in your brain is lighting up because you're looking at something, and the auditory cortex is lighting up because you're hearing a sound, and so on. There's all these physical things happening when you get the feedback. So maybe that's why this effect is happening. So the next step that I need to take is, how do I test only awareness, like pure awareness, without any physical effect at all? That's not easy because
Yeah.
there are neural correlates of awareness, right? So how do you get the brain out of it? So far I've only thought of one way of doing this, and that is to record many, many sessions of data using the device and not look at any of the data. And
Right.
then, like the next day or next month, play it back while people are doing the same task and intersperse periods where you're playing back the data that hadn't been observed yet with real-time data. So like every 30 seconds, I switch which kind of data you're looking at. And then you would say, okay, if it's a physical effect, then you will only see the change in interference in real time because
Mm-hmm.
there is a real physical thing happening. But if you also see it with what we can think of as a time delayed version, then it really has to do only with awareness because there's no brain activity happening then
Yeah.
because no one was looking at it back then. So that's part of the design and a few other tweaks to it that I'll include in the next protocol.
Wow. Lots to unpack. I want to really understand as much as I can about the results, and I'm sure you've gone through them with a tooth comb and kind of looked at all different kind of potential patterns and correlations and stuff. So you said, what was it you said? I'm drawing a blank now. I guess I'll ask you something else. You mentioned that the meditators were less successful than the magicians in this. So how big was the difference? How convincing was that gap? Yeah, let's start there.
Well, so I can give an answer in probabilistic terms. It's all
Mm-hmm.
statistics. So
Yeah.
it's 0.008.
Okay.
Well, that's pretty good. It's
How
not like 10 to
significant?
the
Yeah.
minus gazillion, but
Fairly.
yeah, it's something.
Yeah. Okay. And were there was it kind of fairly balanced and even across the board in terms of individual performance, or were there like a few standout, participants?
There was a distribution of results.
Yeah.
Initially, when we ran it, two people got results beyond 7 sigma,
Mm-hmm.
which is trillions and trillions to one. It's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 trillion to one, something like that, with the actual results that they got. Well, that's unreasonable. Nobody's going to get that kind of result. So I sent them additional interferometers and had them redo to see if they were able to really do it, because maybe there are 1 or 2 billion people in the world who can do it. And then the results look more normal. They both got results still in the same direction that they did before, but not wildly crazy, which
Mm-hmm.
tells me that something happened during the process of shipping the interferometer to them. Like it was
Right.
jostled too much and something went wrong with the setup. Uh, and so I used the revised data set, their new data,
Mm-hmm.
and replaced the old data because that was unrealistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one of the disadvantages of sending apparatus through the mail. Uh, Something can happen. Well, in those cases, even if something didn't happen, I still wouldn't use that data because normally you're dealing with data that kind of falls under a nice bell-shaped curve,
Mm-hmm.
and one was way out to the right and one was way out to the left. So
Yeah.
it really distorts when you're doing statistics, it's very distorted, and I simply didn't want to take the chance
Yeah.
of saying, well, I think I believe this because actually I didn't. I thought something must have gone wrong with the apparatus.
Yeah. And
But
if I remember,
fortunately, in the other 45 people, everything worked perfectly well.
awesome. And yeah, if I remember rightly, I think from when I read The Conscious Universe, you've done that a fair bit with kind of analysis, like taking out the extreme outliers on either side to, yeah, hone in on that, the bell curve, the bulk of the results.
Yeah. If you can do non-parametric statistics, which don't need a bell curve, but every step along the way in this experiment and the other ones that we did, we do as conservative an analysis as we possibly can. And that means getting rid of things that look like outliers. So there are a whole bunch of different algorithms that you can use to say reject outliers. Typically, when you think of it in terms of the bell-shaped curve, somewhere around 3 standard deviations from the center. You'd say anything beyond that, it might be real, but we're going to be conservative and just cut it at that point. So we're using like this overall curve that's truncated at 3 sigma. And again, that is very conservative because you might be getting rid of people who did really, really well.
Yeah.
But we're looking at how people perform on average and not so much how individuals perform.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it's potentially, some of these results are potentially understated rather than overstated. That's, again, kind of plays into the favor of the what's happening here. And you mentioned the control and, when people were not able to see the results of both sides. Can you talk a little bit more about that and about how, again, in statistical terms, but then maybe you can kind of put it into layman's terms, how significant the difference was?
Well, the difference was, is there interference happening in the spot of light where they get feedback?
Yeah.
So that's a question. And the metric that I was using was the slope of the effect, because when you look at the data, you'll see an obvious slow increase in that result. And so you get some kind of slope. And then you say, well, what was happening at the same time in the other sensor? And that has a slope too. We're looking at trends over time. So the measure of interest was the difference in the 2 slopes. So for example, if you took something like temperature in the box as a measure, and you look at the 2 slopes, they're exactly the same. So you get no difference there. And that tells you that there's nothing that is happening differently when observed versus not observed, because those are the 2 slopes you can look at in that case. In this case, it's 2 things measured simultaneously. Well, how are they behaving? So the difference is associated with 9 standard errors, to 9 sigma, which is a bazillion to 1. Which is so strong that you have to wonder, well, really? Could it possibly be that strong? Now you can do another measurement, because both of those, that difference is happening when observation is taking place. Remember, you're only observing what's happening there, but this one's recorded simultaneously. So that produced a 9 sigma effect. Now say, well, what was happening when there was no observation? So now it's not looking at this, and this one you've never looked at, but they're both under the condition of not observing. The probability of that difference is 0.5. So completely a chance.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly how to interpret this, because it's such a strong difference in these 2 conditions. And I've looked at it in lots of different ways, because you can look at the individual amount of light in each one of the sensors. You can do all kinds of things. And it looks like it stands up. So now it comes down to, well, how do we interpret this? So there's a whole laundry list of possible reasons or interpretations as to why you would get that effect. The most likely effect from a conventional perspective is that when the observation is taking place, there's feedback on the screen. There's something being drawn on the screen, and there's sound that's being made, and there's lights. There's all kinds of things happening. So the physical environment is different, and that could disrupt what's going on inside the box. Unfortunately, that doesn't explain why the unobserved light didn't show that.
Yeah.
So it looks like something was happening, and the most obvious explanation doesn't really fit very well. So I won't bother going through all of the other possibilities here, but one of those possibilities is that if you consider this as a kind of a weak measurement, in quantum mechanics, there's strong measurements and weak measurements. A strong measurement is, absolutely that something happened. That definitely changes a photon, for example, from a wave to a particle. But you also can get partial information. a weak measurement, where you're not really changing things very much, but you just get like a hint that something happened. And there's lots of ways of doing that. When you have weak measurement of a single quantum object, like an ion in an ion trap or an atom or something like that, and you repeatedly measure it again and again, each time you measure it, you disrupt it a little bit. And the second time you disrupt it a little bit more. And eventually all those disruptions keep building up. And you start losing coherence in the system more and more. And if it happens to be something like a photon, you can trap a photon, but it's not that. But it was like a photon, you would begin to decrease the amount of interference over time because of this effect. Well, here we're not dealing with a single photon or an atom. We're dealing with a gazillion photons per second because it's a continuous beam laser. But maybe something is happening that is slowly creating a disruption in photons that carry over, and it's an effect called back action. Whenever you observe something in the quantum world, it changes its behavior, and that affects the entire interference pattern. It's a back action that's occurring. Maybe it persists. Why it persists, we don't know. But there's continuous mental observation of a continuous beam of photons, and the results that we saw are what they are. So in the paper that I'm writing, I have a whole section on how do we then interpret this? I go through all the conventional ways and then start dealing with maybe some unconventional ones, because to my knowledge, no one has ever tried this particular design before. So I think back on the kinds of studies that I've done, basically any psychic thing that you can measure in a laboratory. I think this is probably the first original idea that I've had out of all of the others. Most of the other things are what you generally do in science, which is to look at what somebody else did and say, oh, I think I can improve that, or I want to replicate it, or something like that. Well, this one, I'm pretty sure no one has done before. And it's not so much of seeing that observation maybe will change interference, but simultaneously measured and observed and unobserved within the same environment, because that gives you a much better clue about actually what is going on. And so, I mean, it's kind of sad in a sense that I've been doing this for almost 40 years, and I can think of all the things I've done that, like, this is the one original thing I thought of. That's just kind of sad.
I think it's a symptom of there's just not enough researchers in this area. So you've had to take on the role of, replicating and redoing and rehashing various experiments.
Yes, which reminds me that over the years I've met with maybe half a dozen billionaires who had some interest in psi, and they always say, well, if you had an unlimited budget, what would you do with it? And what they're always looking for, I think, is, I want to do these series of experiments because then it will mean this. But I don't tell them that, and maybe that's why they never gave me any money. So my answer is, what I would do is create an educational career track in this area. So there's not just me and 100 colleagues around the world, but there's tens of thousands of us that are pounding on this problem, because that's the only way you're going to make any kind of major advancement. It's possible that among us 100 people there's a genius who will break the thing open. That's unlikely to happen. So we need the way to embed this in the academic system is to create endowed chairs. You go to a dozen universities around the world, create an endowed chair specifically for this kind of research, which you don't even need to cast in terms of psychic phenomena. You cast it in terms of psychophysical interactions. And in quantum mechanics, there's an opening there, right? That's the whole measurement problem is all about psychophysical interactions, maybe. But there are ways of making this happen that would cost probably $100 million or something like that to make a bunch of endowed chairs. That would completely change the complexion of this kind of research within 1 or 2 student generations, which is pretty fast because we're talking about 10 years, maybe. Yeah. And that would begin to break the taboo that has prevented this kind of research from accelerating. I think it is accelerating slowly, but it's really slow simply because there are so few of us that are doing this full time.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully that will happen. Hopefully there will be more money put into it in that sense for more chairs, endowed chairs, and to get more people studying this, more people interested in this area. But next time you're talking to a billionaire and you tell them that, at least at the end of it, say, however, if you just want some experiments, here's what I've got. And then we can get you your $250,000 budget then for your experiments.
Well, I usually do that too, but by that time they're not paying any attention anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. So back to the results of the sigil. Was there anything else really curious or intriguing that stood out to you? Anything else you want to highlight or talk about?
I don't think so, no. This was even though I pre-registered some of the results, it was essentially a pilot study using a new type of apparatus.
Yeah.
But the results were certainly encouraging enough to go for a second round using a similar device. And lessons learned, I designed the whole thing and built it. And I have ideas about how to make it a lot better now, which, I mean, that should be expected. I didn't have enough time or money to make the perfect device the first time around, but it'll get better with time.
Yeah. Because contrary to what some of the staunch skeptics of the past said, that's what good parapsychology is. It's same as every other kind of science. It's improving upon previous experiments and making it more watertight and everything like that. So when do you plan to do this round 2? Do you have any kind of dates, and how do you plan to improve on it specifically? Like what's the plan?
Well, the grants were submitted only within the last month or two. And so I won't hear whether I'm going to get those for another 6 months, maybe.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, almost everything I do depends on funding to support it, especially in this case because it involves building apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of one of the things I'm going to do, as I mentioned, a way of more specifically testing, is this really have to do with awareness or not? Because as best as we can tell from a parapsychological perspective, awareness is not bound in space or time. That's why a delayed choice or a retrocausal version ought to work. Mm-hmm. And there's already a whole bunch of experiments using random number generators with retrocausal designs that do work. Yeah. So I kind of suspect that this would work too. And if it does work with this I'm not going to use the term delayed choice because that's what's used in quantum mechanics. If it works under that kind of protocol, that would provide very, very strong evidence that we're really dealing with something like consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it's not that different than what I've already done, except this time delay piece. So the other part is that the kind of laser system that I want that would be called ultra stable. It's used when you're doing quantum interferometer work. It costs about $100,000. I don't have $100,000 to buy a single laser. So instead, I'm thinking of ways of, first of all, if you buy a cheap laser, the ones I was using in this was only $6 per laser, but I bought a whole bunch of them, and I measured in each one what is the inherent noise level in the laser. Huge range. Some of them were as noisy as a 7% noise amount, which means that if you measure it over a period of time, how much does it wobble? What's the variance over time? 7% is not that good. In a lab where you're doing this kind of research, you'd want one that's 0.001%. That's kind of the level of stability that you're looking at.
Wow.
And so some of the ones I was using, like the top end was 7%, which is not so good, but some of them were 0.02%. The same laser. And so the reason why there's the difference is because semiconductors are made, they stamp them out, even these diode lasers, and some of them will simply inherently be better than others. So I figured one way to do this is buy a whole big batch of $6 lasers and just test them all and pull out the ones that are really stable. And then you could add on a feedback circuit so that so the laser is looking at, you have a photodetector looking straight at the light. This is the central maximum in this design that I have. And then you create an electrical feedback system so that the power output the amount of illumination is kept stable, because you can change that by just changing the voltage and current on the diode. So you can put in a high stability circuit so that at least the spot in the center is always exactly the same. You can get pretty high stability that way. But now, of course, we're interested in what's happening on the interference dots on either side. So if those change, and you know that the center is very stable, that would help make the whole system a lot more stable. So that's one of the revisions that I would do. The other revision I would do is hire somebody who is a specialist in optoelectronic design, and maybe also a physicist who's a specialist in quantum interferometer work, and just get their advice on this. If you were going to build this and you had a budget of, say, $2,000, what would you do?
Mm-hmm.
And then you use that expert advice as a way of making the system as stable as humanly possible without a gigantic budget. So I think with between $1,000 and $2,000, I can do a lot better than I did.
Okay. Wow. Well, we look forward to that. And are you working on any other experiments, or is there anything, what else is going on at the moment? Anything else you're currently working on?
Well, so I have a new book coming out next year, so I spent a fair amount of time working on the book, but that's
Awesome.
now with the publisher, so I'm not working on that anymore. I seem to be doing about 1 or 2 podcasts a week.
Wow.
Now.
Yeah.
So this is partially because for a period of 6 months, I wasn't doing any interviews at all because I was working on the book and I needed the time to focus on that.
Yeah.
And then I have about 15 different tasks on my to-do list, some of which are reanalyzing data from previous experiments and getting it published. I have a whole backlog of things that I've done that I haven't actually written up yet.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's part of it. And then helping some of the other folks on our team. So like one of the experiments we're doing is a replication of 2 people at a distance where there's a sender and a receiver, and the receiver, what we're measuring in them is their electrogastrogram. It's like the EEG of the belly brain.
Right. Okay.
And even almost has a similar name. It's not EEG, it's EGG, electrogastrogram. The signal looks a lot like the signals in your brain. So it's a wavy signal, but it's about, what is it, 100 times slower? It's a very slow moving signal, but it reflects what is going on in the gut. So we call this it's been dubbed the Telly-Belly experiment. It's not telepathy, but Telly-Belly. And the protocol is that you put the receiver in a shielded place, record their electrogastrogram, and meanwhile, the sender is looking at video clips that evoke emotions. We want to see if the sender's emotions can be reflected in the receiver's gut. And so this came about from the idea of saying, well, oftentimes we talk about gut feelings or gut hunches, and maybe that's reflecting that people sometimes do feel an actual effect in their gut when there's some kind of emotional thing happening, like a telesomatic effect or whatever. And so we did this first experiment, I don't forget exactly how long ago, 14 or 15 years ago, and found a significant result. And so now one of our other scientists is replicating it using more modern methods.
That sounds fascinating. Because there is this link between at least the brain and the guts, right? That we're kind of learning more and more about all the time, in the sense of, like the mental health issues can cause then issues in the digestive system, and I guess the other way around as well.
Yep.
And so, it's fascinating, the idea that it could be also interrelated with consciousness, which we think, essentially is probably coming through the brain, transmitting through the brain.
It
potentially.
may be coming through the belly brain.
Yeah.
Right. We don't know.
Brain.
We think
True.
that these kinds of sensitivities bubble up from the unconscious. But what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
Are there unconscious elements to portions of your body that are not your brain?
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, the belly brain has most of the same kind of neurons as you have in your head, and a pretty tight nexus of them too. So it is kind of a belly brain. It is a brain. As far as we know, it doesn't have its own separate consciousness, or maybe what we think of as consciousness sort of hovering around the head somewhere, maybe some of that actually is from the gut, right? The nervous system's all connected. So yeah, so with that's why this as a variation of a telepathy type of experiment, you thought, well, okay, let's try that.
Yeah.
So then another project, you may have heard of Michael Persinger and the kind of work that he did with the God helmet and that sort
Hmm.
of thing. So he was a psychologist at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Canada. He passed away a few years ago. One of the things that he developed in his lab was this thing they called the octopus, which was a magnetic stimulation system that would create a magnetic field that would rotate around your head. So he had a theoretical reason for devising this thing. And he claimed uh, that all kinds of interesting things would happen as a result. They call it a God helmet because it would stimulate a mystical experience and a bunch of other things. But the most important one from our perspective was that if you had two people wearing this thing and you did an EEG correlation experiment at a distance, it looked like the brains became correlated. So normally you would do this experiment, you don't do anything to these people. You just have them separated at a distance and you see whether or not one person thinking about the other or one person getting a stimulus, does the other person's brain jump? So that's an EEG correlation experiment. What Persinger claimed was that you could evoke this in two people who had just met. If they both have the same kind of magnetic stimulation going on, then their brains get into sync. And this led eventually to something that he was began to call excess correlation, like an entanglement effect. And he and his people in his lab then demonstrated in a variety of different systems that it looked like if you take like the space around this magnetic thing, which is usually like a foot around, whatever was going on in that space would be echoed or would be show a correlation with whatever was happening to another one of those somewhere else. And so what I'm going to try to replicate here, because I want to eventually see if we can do this with brains,
Hmm.
is to replicate a study that they did involving water. So the way it works is you have two beakers of water, you put one of these stimulation things on it. The version I'm using they call the halo because it looks kind of like a halo. It's not the octopus thing, it's a halo. They both have magnetic fields running in them. And then you measure the pH in the water in both of them. You pour acid in this one, and that one turns base. Well, that would be a correlation. That's a correlation, but very similar to entanglement
Hmm.
because you've changed the property of this one, the other one will change accordingly, changes to the other property. Just like it does with photons. If you do a photon polarization experiment in this, the other one goes the other way. So I got all of the papers. I spoke to the people who did the experiments. I have one of their original systems. I'm going to build another one just for fun and see if I could replicate that. Because if I can, if this claim is true that you could take a physical system and create what amounts to macroscopic entanglement between this and that, any two things, and they tried lots of different things in this kind of setup. And more or less, usually, at least what's reported is that they always found that there was some kind of relationship that developed that shouldn't be there. So that's after I finish a few writing assignments, that's the next experimental thing that I'll be working on. And
Exciting.
I have all the stuff ready for it. I just haven't had time to put it together and try it. But
Yeah.
if that works, that would be so revolutionary that it should make our heads explode.
Yeah. Just, I mean, lots of your stuff has made my head explode, but yeah, that will absolutely do the same. Have you got a name for it, that experiment?
I haven't made up a name for that yet. That's a good point. I should come up with some cute acronym. I know I haven't done that yet. It's a
Okay,
good
no
idea though.
worries. Well, let me know when you do. For now, it's like kind of God Helmet Mark II, or not quite the Halo.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really the halo.
yeah.
The halo is a much simpler design. And in fact, if you go, I'll let me spend a second here and I'll find the website because the website is quite interesting.
Cool.
Um, I'm going to give you this in the chat and then you can
Hmm.
post it if you wish.
Awesome.
So here. That's the website. So this is a website called Excess Correlation, and
.net.
it gives a whole bunch of information about the background and the equipment and protocols and everything.
Awesome.
It's not that difficult to make. I asked the people who originally were working with this, how come nobody's tried to replicate this thing? I mean, this is beyond revolutionary. I think that's the answer. Why would, like, if you take somebody who has the skills to be able to do this and time and energy and all the rest of it, uh, they would say, this is ridiculous. This can't possibly work. Why should I waste my time doing that? Well, I've spent a lot of time in my career replicating things that a lot of people think don't exist. Sometimes they do exist. So I figured, okay, well, this would be useful to look at. I'm not sure that I completely understand all of the theoretical underpinnings, but this was developed based on a theoretical idea about why it ought to work.
Yeah.
The fact that they built something and it works, well, that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully maybe next year, are you hoping to get to that, or do you think it'll be further in the
No,
future?
I'll probably get to it within a couple of months.
Oh,
So, I
okay.
mean, probably we're almost at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be January before I actually get to doing the experiments, but
Yeah.
this, because it doesn't involve humans, just purely a lab study, it'll be much, much faster. I mean, the SIGIL experiment has taken like a year and a half to get
Yeah.
to where we are now because of dealing with lots and lots of people and all the rest of it. It's just
Yeah.
taking forever.
Making stuff, sending it out to everybody, waiting for
Yeah,
it to come back, and yeah,
that
that's
took a lot. I will try to avoid that in the future because it just took too much time. This thing, I should be able to do the entire experiment and finish it and write it up within 2 months, I would
okay.
guess.
Awesome. So maybe like spring kind of time next year, we'll be able to hear some results on that, all
Yeah,
being well, if all
yeah.
goes smoothly. And the belly brain experiment that you mentioned, is that with ions? Is that a colleague
Yeah.
at Ions that's working on that? And do you know when maybe that will be wrapped up and when results might be expected on that, or you're not sure?
I believe the protocol is 30 participants.
Hmm.
Um, the usual constraint in when you're doing an in-lab study is finding them, finding the
Hmm.
right people,
Yeah.
because they also have to be close enough to be able to get to the lab. And this is in the IONS lab, which is in Northern California. So I don't know, might take 4 months, five
Yeah.
months. So the method of analysis will be set up beforehand. Uh, It'll be very similar to what I did in the previous paper. So I'll probably do some exploratory studies as well with the
Hmm.
data once it's in hand. So it won't, it's nowhere near as complicated as the SIGIL study has been.
Yeah. One other thing you mentioned a little while back, and I made a note that I wanted to come back to it, is you said you're writing a new book. Well, you've written a new book. Is there anything you can say about it now? Have you got a title? And you mentioned it's going to be covering some of your old unpublished experiments. And can you kind of give any other hints as to what else is going to be in there?
Part of the motivation for this, and it looks like the title will be Enchantment.
Cool.
That's like the main title. The subtitle is not yet clear. It might be something like what was the ones we were floating? A practical guide, a practical guide to real magic for the modern mind,
Hmm.
something like that. So
Cool.
it kind of describes what it's about.
Yeah.
So the motivation for this was from my previous book, Real Magic, which I see behind you there.
Yeah.
Uh, Many people then send me emails asking, well, how do I do it? What do I do? So I address that question. Whoops. I address that question in this book, where I have a whole section on methods of magic, mostly enchantment.
Hmm.
Uh, and I originally had this set up so that it sort of started with that because I figured that's what people wanted to know. And after discussing this with the editor, she said, no, you need to start with the scientific side of this. So first, all of the reasons why this actually has a rational basis for it, to
Hmm.
call it real magic. So that's what I've done. I've changed the orders of things. So it's first a bunch of science, which is
Hmm.
a lot of the experiments that I've done and others I've done that I haven't talked about yet, which support the idea of what factors are involved in making magic work. And then a whole section on history and philosophy, which helps ground the science because it doesn't fall out of the sky. It's based on a lot of previous ideas. And then practice. So the practice is like the third part of the book.
Yeah.
And so it includes sigil methods and word magic and knot magic and candle magic and things like that. All of these different methods, which the reason why I go through it is because I would say then that if you were a kinesthetic type of person, you know, like you need to feel stuff happen. A lot of the methods that are used in magic are mental. It's like purely it's in your head. The reason why I like not magic, which I'm not sure I even heard about before I started getting into this, it literally means you take a piece of yarn or take a leather piece or something and make it into knots.
Right.
So when you're pulling the knot, you've made it the knot, but you're pulling it, you're pushing your intention in the knot, but you're doing it kinesthetically. So you're using mental energy and physical energy to do something, and you're pushing it in there. And by doing that, you're pushing this intention inside your head outwards. You happen to be capturing it in a knot, but nevertheless, that's one of the ideas of this kind of magic, where you may make multiple knots, where you repeatedly are pushing intention, pushing intention. And this was one of the reasons why in the sigil experiment, I was thinking, well, this is an act of pushing attention and intention away from you, which is why I thought it might do better in that experiment, and it did. So many of the methods of magic are mental, like word magic. Words are magical. Spell casting, spell is not an accident that that word is used. Uh, there's an interesting linkage between the word chanting and enchantment. So chanting, when you go back to Latin and figure out what it says, it means to sing. Kind of makes sense, chanting. Enchantment means to sing into, which is a little spin on it, which is interesting because it means that it's not simply singing, but it's singing with an intention to essentially push it out. You're pushing it out. So it's like word magic. You're creating words which traditionally are thought to have their own power. And my guess is they do have power because otherwise book banning would not be as popular as it is. I mean, this actually does say that words are known to have power, even though we don't think of it in modern terms as a magician might. But if somebody can get so upset with a book, which is just a bunch of words, that they feel they need to ban it or burn it in some cases, like the Harry Potter books were regularly banned by people with religious convictions because they think it's demonic, and they're ruining the inner world of children because they're making them think about magic, which they shouldn't be doing. So yes, word magic can be very powerful.
Yeah.
And the other magic methods too. So I like the knot magic once I learned how to do it because you can, if you're skilled at it, which I'm not, but if you're skilled at making knots, you can make all kinds of interesting little shapes. So I tried making a little shape out of a man. It doesn't quite look like a man very much, but that's what I ended up with. And then one of the things when you do a magical practice is you don't want to obsess over it because you keep it too present in your consciousness. You want to push it into the unconscious. So I don't actually remember what the magical spell was. Like I put it in there, many, many knots are in there, and I don't remember exactly what it was about. But I guess I'll find out someday. So I just keep it around and say, well, that was a pretty nice thing, but I don't know what it means.
Are you kind of always working on one? Have you always got one on the go, or have you got like a load of them that you've already made?
No, actually, this is the one and only. That's my one not magic. I have lots and lots of other things on my desk here though that are kind of in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I'm intrigued like about the not magic and also the word magic. You were saying, yeah. So you're the one that mentioned Harry Potter. So how similar are we talking to Harry Potter here? Like, how does this work? And obviously, I'm not suggesting it's going to be the same level, but yeah, what are the similarities and differences?
It's always surprising to me that they have to remind people that the movies is not like real life. Fiction is not real life. If it was, it wouldn't be very interesting to read or watch.
Yeah.
But the essence of it is there.
Yeah.
So are we talking about people flying and levitating and being invisible and things that you would see in traditional yogic lore as well? No. Based on what we see in the laboratory and also from real magicians, people are doing this sort of practice, the effects work. They're generally a lot weaker than people think. They don't always work. And the moment that you're doing enchantments or spells that involve other people, it gets really tricky very quickly, which is generally why you're advised not to do that, because now there are conflicting intentions, conscious or unconscious. Anytime you are asking for something to happen that involves other people, they consciously or unconsciously would say, oh, no, you don't. And there could be back reaction to it as well. Like, I mean, from an Eastern perspective, there could be karma developed as a result of pushing the universe in a certain way that anything else doesn't like. Maybe the universe itself inherently doesn't like certain things. Like it doesn't like bending space-time too much, and it will hurt you as a result, or at least have a back reaction in some way. So magic works. And you see this also just in what's called a new thought genre of books. So manifestation and law of attraction and so on. All of that stuff is based on the same ideas, that your belief, your intention can manipulate aspects of the world physically. And in this parapsychological world, it's simply a psychokinetic effect. So I think fortunately, most of the time, these effects are real, but very, very small, very weak.
And is it about oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it kind of, word specific, sound specific, or is it more about the intention behind the word? And yeah, I mean, start there.
Well, for word magic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is partially the words, but because the words carry their own intention.
Because of the meaning.
The connotation is in the word. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a lot of traditional magic, the words that are used are names of entities, like the old gods, that sort of thing, typically said in a language that you don't know.
Right.
Old Hebrew, Aramaic, things like that, because then it carries its own sense of gravitas to it. So a lot of the chanting in traditional ceremonial magic is chanting Latin or chanting these ancient languages because of the idea that that will resonate more with previous people who are trying to get spirits to do things on their behalf. So one of the things I say in my book is that we don't have any scientific ways yet to study this third category of magic called theurgy, which is all about spirits. So there's a lot of traditional magic, which is about evoking spirits and invoking spirits and doing things with spirits. Very, very difficult to test that. We don't know how to test that at this point. The closest that anybody has come to was to essentially create a servitor. So a servitor is a thought form that is brought to life.
Right.
So in the different
Is there
traditions,
another name for that? I think I've heard of it under another name.
So egregor is a name, and tulpa is a name.
Tulpa, that's what I've come across.
Golem is a name. These are all, most cultures have a tradition where you either literally create something out of clay, like a golem, and bring it to life, or you simply, through the act of imagination, create a spirit. So the one and only test that I know of was a group of people who got together and tried that. They tried to see, could they make up a fictional person, but then behave as though that person was real. And they were doing this in the context of a seance. So they would use rapping noises and things that you would normally see in a seance to talk to this fictional person that the group decided they wanted to create.
Yeah.
So the name of the book is called Conjuring Philip.
I was going to say, I thought it was the Philip experiment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Philip experiment. So they conjured up something that they made up. Well, yeah, I mean, that magicians will create these as servitors and lots of other names similar to that, where it's like a thought form that they instantiate in some way, and then there it is, created it. So because we know that that can happen, at least in somewhere between a laboratory effect and an anecdotal effect, That suggests that in most of the other cases where someone wants to evoke a spirit, maybe that's what's happening too,
Mm.
right? So how do you create something that is independent from that? Because it always involves humans doing something. These spirits apparently don't fall out of the sky unless apparently you take something like DMT and then they're always there,
Yeah.
right? So in psychedelic states, people meet these creatures all the time. Of course, when you're in a psychedelic state, it's very difficult to know is it your mind that's doing this? Is it a truly independent entity? The only thing I think that's quite interesting about the DMT experience or the 5-MeO DMT version is that people will say they will go into that space, they will meet one of these machine elves or some other kind of creature who will recognize them the next time they come back. And
Whoa.
other people will talk about meeting the same creature.
Yeah. That's
So,
wild.
yeah, it's
What
very
do you do
wild.
with that?
Yeah,
Have
I
you
mean,
spoken to?
it gets a little bit closer to what magicians will traditionally talk about as the entities really are independent. They're really there.
Mhm.
And no, it's not that we're hallucinating what's going on. And it's not a servitor either. It's something
Yeah.
independent.
Yeah.
So,
Have you ever witnessed anything like that? Somebody trying to do something along those lines?
no.
No. What is the craziest thing or the most impressive display of PK, of psychokinesis, that you've witnessed personally ever?
Oh, that's easy. That's this,
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
right? Because I did that.
Yeah.
So this wasn't just witnessing it, it was participating in it. So, yeah. So before I did that, I was pretty sure that macroscopic psychokinetic effects probably didn't happen. So, and even though I had friends who were able to do such things, they showed me what they did. I still didn't quite believe it because, like, how could that's way too big? They were no longer dealing with statistics on this. You don't need to do an analysis. There it is. But after I did it, of course, I can't deny that it's there and it happened somehow. So it reminds me that we don't really know the limits of what we're dealing with. We're
Mm.
dealing with a real phenomena, mostly weak as we see in the laboratory, and you need statistics in order to be able to see it at all. But maybe it scales up.
Yeah.
Apparently, it does scale up in some cases.
Do you think it's going to scale up as we evolve? Like as if humans continue to exist for, let's say, 500, few thousand years, whatever. Do you think, even if it's subtle increments, do you think these kind of phenomena will become more prevalent? Or do you think it, rather than evolving, it would be in essence just more of the population realizing or coming to understand that these things are real? Either way, do you think they're going to become more prevalent and more powerful as we go?
I think that one of the reasons why these effects are generally weaker today than they have been in the past is largely because of this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We are distracted so much in the modern world by
Disconnected.
the devices and connection and so on, and crazy amount of things to do,
Mm-hmm.
and not having to worry too much about a tiger that's about to eat you, that we just don't pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, we know from laboratory experiments on telepathy, for example, that the vast majority of the thousands of sessions that have been run are with college sophomores who don't claim any ability.
Mm-hmm.
They're signing up because they want credit for their psychology course, and they show these effects. People who do have the experiences will do better in a laboratory, but it suggests that there's something about the nature of consciousness that it simply has this capacity. It's non-local in some way. And most of the time, you're just not paying attention to it. Whereas in an indigenous society that don't have these distractions, or where you absolutely need to have heightened senses
Mm-hmm.
so that you're not eaten by a tiger, well, then people are simply a lot more sensitive to it because they have to be. And so I think what may happen in the future is the more that we begin to understand what consciousness is, where it comes from, what it can do, and so on, that methods will be devised to allow us to access it more easily. And maybe it's electronic gizmos like the halo that will
Mm-hmm.
help us do that, or maybe certain drugs, or maybe genetic treatments, or who knows. lots of things can be developed, just like we develop all kinds of technologies, to help push us into the space, whatever mental space that is, where rather than this being a spontaneous thing that may happen once, that we'll understand how to do it, and we can start creating entirely new metal alloys simply by thinking about it, or
Mm.
levitate, or who knows what.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The possibilities are unknown. And as you say, as we kind of do these, we develop technology or whatever to help people to engage with these things. We may also develop technology based on these phenomena and these abilities. I think we touched on it in a previous conversation, but other than, like the obvious of spying and using it to find things, what other practical or commercial kind of uses of these phenomena do you think will or potentially could be around in the future? Like, just speculate on that or if there's any ideas that you've had.
Well, so pushing quite far out in the future,
Yeah.
my colleagues who are very interested in the whole UAP
Mm-hmm.
phenomenon, all of them say that it involves consciousness in some way.
Mm.
That kind of suggests that if indeed these are drones or alien craft or something like that and involving consciousness because they are reactive to what people are thinking, that maybe they're ships that are driven by consciousness. Maybe they're created by consciousness. It's some kind of technology that an advanced civilization has learned that aspects of the physical world can be shaped by consciousness. And so in some respects, something like metal bending is sort of in that domain, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, something happened that shouldn't happen with metal and related in some way to my own motivation at that time. So I can imagine that I don't know how long in the future, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years in the future, it will be recognized that ultimately everything is consciousness, in which case all bets are off in terms of what you can do. So
Mm.
a UAP, as we currently are observing them, uh, could be actually rather elementary. Because if you're truly like a consciousness being, you don't need a craft. And unless it's being used to interact with creatures who wouldn't recognize us otherwise. I mean,
Mm.
maybe it's like a game that's being played or probing us in some way to find out how we react to such things. So that's like a long-term possibility. On the short term, I think there will be, the more that we understand about what's going on, the more pressure there will be to not look at it.
Mm.
And for an interesting reason, from a scientific perspective, huge reasons to try to understand what is the role of consciousness in the physical world. That's my curiosity. That's why I'm in this field. But imagine that we figured out a way of making telepathy really, really good. You can turn it on, you can turn it off. You really know very high detail what others are thinking. The entire justice system would change. Everything about business would change. Politics
Mm.
would radically change. Everything that we think about in terms of how the modern world works, including interpersonal relationships, would change.
Yeah.
Because there are no secrets.
Yeah.
And a world with no secrets is not the civilization that we have evolved into. We'd have to evolve into something completely different, which the only thing that we have that is kind of in that direction is in science fiction terms as the hive mind.
Mm.
So how is the hive mind portrayed? Almost always as horrific. It's the Borg in Star Trek. It's the invasion of the body snatchers. On and on and on. It's always that this mind collective completely eliminates your own personal ego. And to most people now, that's like the worst possible thing that could ever happen.
Yeah.
So how do we evolve from the civilization we have now to one where there are no secrets, there's no personal egos, because that is the direction that this research is pointing, that we will eventually figure out how to do that. So you can imagine people who hold the strings of power in today's world, they will not be interested in that at all.
Yeah.
Politics with no secrets, business with no secrets, crime with no secrets. All
Yeah.
of it is gone.
Yeah. politics might actually be useful for a change if that was the case, though, right? But it would totally shake things up unbelievably. It would be
Well,
enormous.
in a sense, you won't need politics anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Politics and many other things only exist because people have differences, many of which are secret, but they have differences and they have a lot of difficulty in resolving the difference. If you were able to mentally merge with somebody else, there would be no difficulty at all.
Yeah.
And so differences would begin to dissolve. So, think about a civilization of that type. What would it do, right? If everything kind of settled down in terms of these kinds of differences, so that a case can be made that in order for a civilization or organisms to get to a certain point of evolution, they need this struggle. It's like the struggle for survival, the struggle of differences in opinions, they can't resolve it and all that. Maybe that is necessary in order to get to the point where the species is resilient enough and intelligent enough and has all the other characteristics that allows them to get to the point where they can suddenly, like one day, realize, oh, we actually don't need that anymore. We can take a next step function into a different way of being. And so, I mean, this is again kind of a science fiction scenario at this point, but I can see how that would happen at some point. And it may not be possible to do it as a gradual change because of the resistance. It may require a step function.
Yeah.
And so the closest novel that I know of, which is like that, is Childhood's End.
Okay.
That's all about basically a step function. All of the children now are different. So one generation, boom, completely different.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah, you mentioned a few of your colleagues and UAP and that kind of thing. There's also my thinking, because you know that I look into the UAP stuff with this podcast as well. I've had the idea, let's just say for a minute that whatever's behind these UAP is simply an extraterrestrial intelligence, physical beings from another star system. However they got here is their business. I don't need to know that for now. Let's say they're 100,000 years ahead of us. I'm sure they would have figured out a way to get here if they've managed to stay alive that long. It also kind of goes in with the idea, if they're just natural beings like us and maybe they or also have an innate psychic abilities, they have 100,000 years of extra evolution or advancement, they may well be so advanced that all of these things that seem to be happening in alleged cases of whatever abductions, UFO sightings, the works, may just be a form of advanced psi that we may have in the future, far in the future, if we stick around that long, if we manage to hold on to our current status as an active civilization. And also on the subject of UAP, since you kind of mentioned it, I'd love it if you could say a few words about your former colleague, your late colleague, Edgar Mitchell. Your relationship with him, the work you've done with him, and just anything you want to say about that, because he's a fascinating character that kind of draws these two worlds together, bridges these two worlds. Who obviously had a big interest in UFOs and founded IONS, which you're now the chief scientist, I think is. So just anything you can share about Edgar and the work and relationship that you shared.
Well, Edgar was far more engaged in IONS in the early days. I used to see him a couple times a year. He would come for board meetings. And so that was most of our interactions, was when he was visiting the campus or the laboratory, and we talked about things. I used to talk to him. I know that he was interested in UFOs or UAPs now. And I know that he tried to figure out what was actually going on. And he told one story where he went to the Pentagon, to whoever was the top guy at the Pentagon at the time.
Yeah.
And Edgar had quite a few classifications at that point. He had security classifications. So he thought he would be able to ask that person, like, what's the real scoop? Part of it being that Edgar grew up in Roswell, Mexico. Yeah. So when we'd visit the old timers there, they would tell him stories that said, no, this wasn't a balloon. This was something completely different. And so he went to this top guy in the Pentagon. So could I get access to whatever the scoop is? And the answer was no. You have all kinds of clearances. You don't have a need to know. And so, I mean, we're slowly beginning to find out now, making it slightly more public, that people have been interested in this for a very long time.
Mm.
Some of it's within the government, some of it's probably not in the government. It's in the military and industrial complex in some way.
Yeah.
Things are known that have not been made public. Maybe some of it, a little bit, is now becoming public. So at least at the time, and this was probably about 25 years ago, where I was talking to Edgar about this, he couldn't find out. Like even somebody with high clearances, without a obvious need to know, including an astronaut, because many of the astronauts have seen strange things going on out there. Sorry, you don't have a need. So that's as far as it went. It was frustrating for him because even though he said he had never seen a UFO directly, a lot of his astronaut colleagues had.
Yeah.
And he heard a lot of stories from credible people who had. So he didn't know what it was. I mean, he wasn't surprised, would not be surprised if it was some kind of extraterrestrial actual entity of some type, an actual craft of some type. Um, but that's about it.
Yeah.
I, I do know that the other thing that Edgar was working on for years with colleagues was what he called quantum holography, which was a combination of principles from quantum mechanics and holography as a way of describing how is it that the physical world is the way that it is, and how would consciousness come into the mix. So that's one of the things that he was pushing as well.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating guy. I would have loved to have interviewed him for this show, and I'm sure we would have had a really interesting discussion going into everything, like the Psi and of course UAP. And I guess he'd love to see what's happened since he passed. Like obviously, it's come forward a long way. Things continue to progress. More people have gone public. But yeah, fascinating. You still haven't seen a UFO, Dean?
No.
No, I like to check in with people here and there just in case,
No, I mean, when I look up now, I see lots of things that are going really fast, but they're satellites.
Yeah, yeah. If you ever
And,
see
and
one
I keep
going,
waiting for one of them to take a right angle turn, but they never do.
yeah, or just zip off at like 1,000 times the speed of most of the other satellites, and it's just like beyond doubt, just have that moment.
No.
Just one of the last things I want to touch on before we finish up today. It's something you mentioned to me before we started the interview. It's this EEG correlations between people at a distance, a paper that was published, I think, recently, and you said, yeah, you're interested to share a little bit about that.
Right. So I had mentioned that the Halo device is perhaps a technology that would make it easier to show that there's something like a brain-to-brain connection at a distance, which would be a brain-centric way of thinking about telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1965, in Science, with one of the two top-rated scientific journals in the world, there was a short article by two people who published a study with identical twins where they separated them. And the stimulus was that when you close your eyes, it produces more alpha waves in your brain. And so they would ask one person periodically to close their eyes, and they would look in the other person's brain, the twin, identical twin, did more alpha appear. And they claimed, after testing 13 pairs, that two of the pairs of twins showed an increase in alpha in the receiving party, using that as evidence that it looked like there was some kind of connection going on at a distance. They didn't use any quantitative measures. They were just using the strip chart. They were comparing the strip charts. And for science to publish that was considered like, what in the world is going on? To publish a qualitative study on something as controversial as ESP, only looking at strip charts. So that gained a lot of nasty comments at the time by people saying, what are you doing here? Why is this published? Including from parapsychologists who said that no parapsychology journal would publish a study like this because it didn't have any quantitative measures to it. So it was a mystery. Well, the two authors of that, their names were Duane and Barrett. They were ophthalmology professors at a university in Pennsylvania. So that remained a mystery. about a year ago, I get an email from a professor in a university in Turkey who said, have you ever found this article, which was by those two authors, but published in 1969, 4 years after this science paper? I said, I'd never even heard of that. I didn't know that they had ever did anything else because nothing was ever published. So where did you find this article? I said, well, he found it in a list, like a government list somewhere. So I tracked it down and found it in the Defense Information Technical Center, something like that. It's one of the
Right.
government archives. And sure enough, there it was. The same two people, 1969, did a replicated study, a much better study with quantitative measures, with identical twins, and also a third party who wasn't related to the twins.
Right.
But the paper wasn't available. It just had like a short abstract. So I called up this place and I spoke to someone and said, could I get a copy of this? And she went away and she came back later saying, no one has ever asked for a copy. It only exists in paper form in like deep in the bowels of their library that there it is.
Yeah.
So I said, well, could I get a copy of it? Yeah. So they went through the Freedom of Information Act, even though it wasn't classified, it still has to be released. A couple of months later, I get a PDF. It is the same people who did a similar experiment, much improved. The first study said that it's an NIH grant, National Institutes of Health grant, which apparently was not because you can't find that listed anywhere.
Right.
The second study, the one that nobody had ever requested before, which somehow this professor in Turkey found out about, was funded by the Office of Naval Research. And it said in there that it was. So it wasn't classified. There were no markings on it that said that this was sensitive or anything. It was just a report that never got published. And in the original study, they said two of the 15 pairs showed significant results just by eyeball. The second study, 11 of the 15 pairs got very significant results, but quantitatively.
Wow.
Which is quite interesting. So the new thing that just happened a few days ago was an article published by the same guy in Turkey who then took the original paper in Science and used modern methods to digitize the graph that was shown in that paper to reconstruct the raw data.
Oh, wow.
EEG data. Brilliant. And so now they had the EEG data from those graphs, and he used modern methods and was able to show that actually the twins weren't showing the significant result, but one of the twins and a stranger, their brains did go in correlation. So more interestingly, he then did the same thing for the 1969 paper. The 1969 paper, where they showed that 11 of the 15 got significant results, about half of them included strangers.
Really?
So it wasn't that there was some magical thing between identical twins. It was some relationship that we don't understand very well, where one person and another person, not genetically related at all, were showing brain correlations at a distance. So this new paper found that as well. They confirmed that, yes, that it actually did happen back then. So this is quite interesting. The method is very, very simple. Right? It doesn't involve stimulation or anything. You just have two people with their eyes open, and then occasionally you tell one of them to close their eyes, and then the brains go into synchrony. Well, that's crazy, but nevertheless, apparently true, and very, very odd that it wasn't made public. The only pointer to that I was able to eventually find with a lot of snooping was that they mentioned it at a medical meeting, like in a conference. I think they had a poster or something mentioning this, but that's it. Otherwise, like what? So now you look at the dates. So the first one said it was NIH, probably not, probably funded by the Navy as well. Mm-hmm. That was 65. The second paper was 69. 3 years later was when the Stargate program officially began. What this suggests is that the US government, probably the Navy in particular, have been interested in this and seeding studies out there, none by parapsychologists, by completely other people. Why they chose ophthalmologists to do an EEG study is a very interesting question, and that I don't know the answer to that. But nevertheless, that's what they did. Maybe there were personal connections, somebody in the Navy and these folks or something. So it suggests that U.S. government interest in this had been around for quite a long time, bubbling below the surface for a long time, and eventually got to a point where somebody decided, we need to put some congressional money behind this and make a bigger program. And that's turned into Stargate. That's why I think that people that will say, well, why did this end in 1995? And my response is, well, why do you think it ended?
Yeah.
These kind of programs appear and disappear all the time. There's always something going on. And there's a long track record, even within government, some of which is classified and most of it which is not, saying, yeah, these are real effects. So would it behoove people in the military and intelligence world to keep their eyes on this stuff? Because if we're doing it, we know that other people are doing it. We have better understand this a lot better than we currently do. Well, so this is like a tiny little piece of the puzzle that came to light as a result of this professor in Turkey. And I've asked him by email and I haven't heard back yet. How did you know about this in the first place? Because like among my colleagues, it was a giant mystery. Like why was this study published in the first place? And who are these people anyway?
Yeah.
Well, now we know a little bit more.
Wow. That's incredible. That's awesome to hear. Thank you for sharing that. And, I look forward to hopefully there being more replications of these studies, because this is fascinating and really, really intriguing. I think I've taken plenty of your time for today, Dean. If there's anything you want to say before I let you go, just like a message or any last words that you want to leave with people that have watched or listened to this.
I will eventually revise my personal website at deanradin.com to when I get the cover of what the new book will be.
Yeah.
So as I said, the title will probably be Enchantment.
Yeah.
And then some subtitle, and I'll have a picture and everything. So when that happens, you'll know that the book itself will probably be out within 3 to 6 months.
Awesome. Are you expecting it's kind of middle of 2025, something approximately?
Something like that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And a quick question about your website. On there, you've got, I think, a sub-page of like peer-reviewed papers on psi phenomena or something to that effect. Do you continually update that? Is that like still active? Because I often put the link in the description for people, and I just wanted to check that that's still, you still add to that occasionally and things like that.
I should, but it's when I look at my to-do list, it's pretty low on my to-do list to keep that up to date.
Yeah.
I could add probably close to a dozen additional articles that I just haven't had time to do it.
Okay, so, but at some point you will, I'm assuming.
At some point in the future, perhaps at the same time when we actually know what UAPs are, then it'll happen. Or who knows, maybe someday somebody will volunteer to actually keep it up to date. But as of right now, no.
Okay, but as of right now, there's still plenty of interesting documents and links in there, right?
Yeah, I have most of my own publications and many, many others as well.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, I'll continue to put that in the description for people that might be interested. And again, thank you so much for today, Dean. I really, really appreciate it. This was fascinating, and I look forward to doing it again at some point in the future. All my best.
Very good. Good.
Thank you to Dean Radin for talking with me again. Thank you to our patrons for their support, and thank you for listening. Please see the description for links and click subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. If you enjoy our show and want to help us grow, please consider supporting us via Patreon. Or if you can't do that, please try to help us find some new listeners this week or whenever you can. It all helps. Thank you.